It started on a calm morning in the mountain town of Cedar Ridge, the kind of place where time moved slower than the clouds drifting over the mountains, where the sound of birds and the scent of pine wrapped the valley in quiet peace, and where Jacob Hale returned after years away, stepping out of his old truck and staring at the 150-year-old log cabin that had stood through storms, winters, and wars. The wood was dark with age, the windows fogged with dust, and yet to Jacob it looked like a living piece of history, his family's history, something that belonged to the land as much as the trees did. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold morning air fill his chest, remembering how his grandfather once told him, "This cabin's not just built on land, son, it's built on roots." He smiled softly at those words, unaware that before the sun set that day, someone would try to rip those roots from under him. As he walked up the old porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots, he noticed how nature had begun to reclaim what was hers. Ivy climbed along the corners, and moss crept between the stones of the chimney. But to Jacob, it wasn't neglect, it was character. Every scratch, every mark, told a story of the hands that built it, the storms that tested it, and the family that protected it. He unlocked the heavy door, pushed it open, and the scent of old timber and memories flooded out, that mix of wood smoke, dust, and time that only old places know. He spent the next few hours sweeping floors, wiping windows, and setting a pot of coffee on the stove, his mind at ease for the first time in years. But peace is a fragile thing, especially in towns like Cedar Ridge, where progress wears a suit, and greed hides behind community rules. It was near noon when the hum of an engine echoed up the gravel road, a deep growl breaking the silence of the forest. Jacob looked up from the porch and squinted into the sunlight. A white SUV rolled slowly up the hill, its paint gleaming too bright for a place like this. When it stopped, a woman stepped out with the kind of confidence that came from believing the world owed her something. She wore oversized sunglasses that reflected the cabin in their mirrored lenses and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her lips curved into a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, two men in reflective vests climbed out and stood stiffly, holding survey poles and rolled-up blueprints. "Good morning," she said in a tone that didn't sound like a greeting. "I'm Karen Lawson, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association." Jacob raised an eyebrow. He didn't remember any HOA when his grandfather lived here. The land around the cabin had always been part of the old forest reserve, far from the new villas on the south side of the mountain. "You're a bit far from your neighborhood, aren't you?" Jacob asked calmly, leaning against the porch railing. She smiled wider, though her voice carried an edge sharper than broken glass. "Actually, this area is under our management now. According to our new development plans, your cabin sits right inside our community boundary." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "That's funny, because this cabin's been here since before your villas existed." Karen's smile didn't fade, but her jaw tightened slightly. She flipped a page on her clipboard. "That may be, but records show this property was part of an old estate that changed ownership decades ago. My family recently purchased rights to the southern tract, which includes this structure." She paused for effect, then added, "It actually belongs to my son now. He'll be moving in once we complete restoration." Jacob blinked, unsure if he heard her right. "Your son's inheritance," he said slowly, his voice low. Karen nodded, her sunglasses hiding whatever emotion she might have had. "That's correct. The deed must have been lost or misfiled, but the law's clear. You can avoid any legal trouble if you vacate before next week." The workers behind her started unrolling maps across the hood of the SUV, marking lines and measuring angles like they were already dividing land. Jacob stepped down from the porch and walked toward them, his boots crunching the gravel. He stopped a few feet away from Karen, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "Lady, my family built that cabin with their hands. My great-grandfather cut those trees himself. You think you can walk up here and claim it belongs to your son?" Karen didn't flinch. "I'm not claiming, Mr. Hale. I'm informing. It's all very legal. The HOA is authorized to maintain property boundaries within its jurisdiction." Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd said them 100 times before to people who didn't have the power to fight back. Jacob studied her for a moment, The way she stood, stiff, proud, certain that she was untouchable. He'd seen that look before in city lawyers and real estate developers, people who thought money and paperwork could erase blood and history. He turned slowly toward the cabin, then back to her. "You said this cabin's part of your development." She nodded. "Yes. Cedar Ridge Heights. Luxury living in the heart of nature. We plan to preserve its rustic charm while upgrading the area." Her voice dripped with fake kindness, but Jacob heard what she really meant. Demolish the soul, sell the shell. He took another step closer, enough for her to see the years of hard work in his eyes, the quiet fire of someone who'd had enough of people like her. "You know, Ms. Lawson," he said evenly, "you might want to double-check those records before you start marking boundaries. Because that cabin, my cabin, has a deed older than your entire HOA." For the first time, Karen hesitated. Her lips parted slightly, but pride forced her to recover. "We'll see about that," she said coolly. "My lawyer will contact you." She turned sharply and signaled the workers to pack up. As the SUV rolled away, a trail of dust rose behind it, glowing golden in the afternoon light. Jacob stood in silence for a long moment, watching the road where the car disappeared. He knew that wasn't the last he'd see of her. People like Karen didn't back down. They doubled down. When the wind shifted, he looked up at the cabin again. The sunlight touched the old wood, and for a brief second, he imagined his grandfather standing there, smiling the same calm smile he always had when things got tough. "Don't let anyone take what's yours," the old man's voice echoed in Jacob's mind. He walked back inside and knelt near the fireplace, his hands brushing against the floorboards. He tapped twice on a loose plank until it lifted slightly, revealing a dark hollow beneath. From that space, he pulled out a small iron chest, blackened with age, its hinges squeaking as he lifted the lid. Inside lay the deed, folded, faded, but still bearing the signature of the county clerk from 1875, along with photographs and letters written by his great-grandfather. It was proof not just of ownership, but of legacy. He traced his fingers over the ink, whispering, "Let's see them try to take this." As the day faded into evening, the forest grew quiet again, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the tree line. Maybe it was just the unease of confrontation, or maybe it was the knowledge that a war had just begun, not with bullets but with papers, lies, and greed. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and stared at the fading light. Down the hill, the roofs of the new villas glimmered in the distance, symbols of everything Cedar Ridge had become. Money over memory, image over identity. He wondered how many others Karen had bullied into giving up their homes. He wondered how many more would fall for her smooth words and printed threats. But he wasn't one of them. Not now. Not ever. That night, as rain began to fall softly on the roof, Jacob sat by the fire, his mind replaying every word Karen had said. Inheritance. Jurisdiction. Vacate. They weren't just words. They were warnings. He pulled out a notebook and started writing down the details. Her name, the HOA's address, the date, the time she arrived. He made copies of the deed and sealed one inside an envelope addressed to his lawyer in the next county over. He knew enough about people like Karen to understand that proof meant nothing if it disappeared at the wrong time. When lightning flashed outside, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, a determined face, and behind him the flicker of firelight that made the cabin look alive. He smiled faintly. They picked the wrong man to mess with. The next morning, Jacob walked into town, his boots wet from the rain, and stopped by the local diner. People glanced up when he entered. Word traveled fast in small towns, and he could already feel the whispers. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but a few avoided his gaze, probably already hearing Karen's version of the story. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and overheard two men at the corner table talking quietly. "You hear about the old cabin up on the ridge?" one said. "The HOA claims it's theirs now. Some inheritance thing." The other man shook his head. "That place has been in the Hale family for generations. Ain't no HOA that old." Jacob smiled to himself. At least some still remembered the truth. When he stepped back outside, The sky had cleared. The air was crisp, and for a moment it felt like maybe things would stay quiet. But halfway up the road, he saw the white SUV again, parked near his gate. Karen stood beside it, talking to a man in a gray suit. The man held a stack of papers and gestured toward the cabin. She saw Jacob coming and smiled that same thin smile. "Mr. Hale," she said as he approached. "This is Mr. Bolton, our association's legal advisor. He'll be handling the transfer of ownership." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Transfer? You haven't got anything to transfer." Bolton stepped forward, handing him a folded document. "This is a notice of boundary reassessment under Municipal Code 48C. It confirms that your property lies within Cedar Ridge Heights jurisdiction." Jacob didn't even look at it. "You people really think a piece of paper can rewrite history?" Karen crossed her arms. "History doesn't matter if it isn't filed properly." Jacob stared at her, the calm in his voice almost unsettling. "Then I suppose it's time you see something that was filed before your grandparents were born." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, hearing her footsteps follow, her curiosity overcoming her arrogance. Inside, he went straight to the fireplace, lifted the loose plank again, and brought out the old chest. He placed it on the table and opened it slowly, the air thick with tension. The lawyer leaned forward, expecting some meaningless relic, but when Jacob unfolded the deed and laid it flat under the morning light, the signatures and stamps told their own story. "Dated 1875, Jacob said softly. "Filed and certified by the original county office. The land was granted to Thomas Hale and his heirs in perpetuity." Karen's smile faltered. The lawyer cleared his throat. This could be a forgery," he said weakly. Jacob leaned closer. "Then by all means, have it checked. I'll even drive it down to the county clerk myself. You'll find the file numbers still in the archives." For the first time, Karen had no words. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, the only sound breaking the silence. Jacob folded the deed again, placed it back in the chest, and said quietly, "Next time you come here, make sure it's to apologize." He walked them both to the door, not raising his voice once, because he didn't have to. Truth doesn't shout, it stands. As the SUV drove away for the second time, Karen's reflection in the window looked smaller than before, her confidence cracking like the cheap glass she hid behind. Jacob sat back down by the fire, the chest beside him, and smiled faintly. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time since she arrived, he knew he wasn't the one who should be afraid. And outside, the mountains stood silent and proud, as if watching the start of something old being reborn. The land remembering who truly belonged, the cabin waiting for justice, and the man who would make sure no one ever stole its legacy again. Be why the next morning the peace that once wrapped Cedar Ridge had already started to fade, and Jacob could feel it in the still air outside his window, the kind of quiet that always came before trouble, the kind that made the birds stop singing and the wind hold its breath. It wasn't long before the mail truck creaked up the road and stopped by his fence, the driver waving awkwardly as he handed over a thick envelope stamped with the golden seal of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. Jacob tore it open right there on the porch, and inside was the first threat wrapped in polite words, "Notice of violation." It read, accusing him of occupying unregistered property within a managed development zone, ordering him to vacate within 14 days or face legal action. He stared at the paper for a long moment, his jaw tight, then folded it slowly and placed it on the table beside his coffee mug. The steam curling around the edge of the letter like a warning. He didn't curse or panic, instead he took another sip and whispered to himself, "So it begins." That same day 2 black SUVs appeared near the bend, men with clipboards walking the border of his land, measuring, pointing, pretending to check the soil while taking photos of his cabin. They didn't say a word, but their presence spoke loud enough. By sunset, he found another notice pinned to his gate. An official HOA inspection scheduled for property evaluation. The arrogance of it made him smile, because they still thought he'd be scared enough to leave before they had to prove anything. But Jacob wasn't raised by men who ran from paper threats. He came from people who built homes when wolves still roamed these hills. He decided he wouldn't fight their noise with anger. he'd fight it with silence and proof. The following morning he drove down to the county records office, the old building smelling of paper, dust, and time, and the clerk, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, smiled when he mentioned the Hale cabin. "Oh honey, that property's older than this town," she said, digging through the archives, the files still bound by leather straps. She pulled out the original registration copy dated a century and a half ago, and when Jacob compared it to his own deed, every signature matched, every mark was real. He thanked her, made certified copies, and drove home with the papers locked in his glove compartment. But as he turned onto the forest road, he noticed a group of strangers standing at his gate, Karen among them, wearing that same smirk. This time she wasn't alone. She had brought her son, a tall young man in designer clothes who looked like he'd never worked a day in his life, his hair perfect, his attitude worse. He leaned against the SUV and called out, "Nice little place you've been squatting in, old man." Jacob didn't reply. He parked the truck, stepped out, and locked eyes with Karen, who said sweetly, "We're here to inspect our future home site, Mr. Hale." Jacob crossed his arms, his voice calm. "You can turn around. This is private property." Karen chuckled softly, "Not for long," and waved her hand, signaling the men behind her to step forward. They carried measuring tapes and survey flags, marching like they already owned the place. But what they didn't see was the small camera hidden inside the carved bear statue near the porch, blinking red, recording every trespass. Jacob didn't stop them. He simply watched, memorizing every face, every word, because evidence speaks louder than rage, and he knew one day soon they'd deny ever being there. As they paced around, Karen's son laughed and kicked the porch step, breaking a piece of wood off and saying, "Guess it's not worth much anyway." And Karen nodded as if inspecting her new project. "Oh, we'll fix it up nicely, modern windows, maybe add a deck," she said, ignoring Jacob's silence, her arrogance filling the air like smoke. Jacob finally said, "You can plan whatever you want, but this cabin isn't going anywhere." She turned sharply, her smile fading. "We'll see," she hissed. Then motioned her team to leave, but not before placing a bright orange tag on one of his fence posts. "Pending HOA review." Printed across it like a scar, Jacob waited until they were gone before pulling it down, crumpling it in his hand, and tossing it into the fire inside, the paper curling, blackening, disappearing into smoke. He whispered, "Let's see who burns next." Over the next few days, the harassment grew subtle but constant. Strange calls late at night, trucks parking near his road, and leaving tire marks, and once, his mailbox ripped from the ground. He never caught them in the act, but he didn't have to. He knew whose hands pulled the strings. Karen's HOA wasn't just a neighborhood board. It was a network of bullies in blazers, used to winning by intimidation, and the more she pushed, the quieter Jacob became. Because silence made people nervous, it made them guess what you were planning, and Karen hated guessing. When the next envelope arrived, it wasn't from the HOA but from the county court, a preliminary hearing notification. They were fast, faster than any normal process, meaning someone had used influence to rush paperwork through. Inside was a petition filed by the HOA claiming disputed ownership and demanding immediate removal of unauthorized occupants. Jacob read it twice, then smiled coldly, because this time, they'd walked into his trap. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small USB drive containing the footage of Karen's inspection, her team crossing his boundary line, marking his property, destroying his porch, all time-stamped and clear. He'd been patient for this very reason. Now the same arrogance that made her bold would become the rope around her neck. He packed the deed, the certified copies, the video footage, and drove into town, his old truck rumbling like a loyal hound ready for one last fight. When he arrived at the courthouse, he walked straight to the clerk's office and submitted his counterclaim, ownership proof under grandfathered property law, backed by federal preservation acts. It wasn't just about his cabin anymore. It was about setting a record no one could erase. When Karen heard about it that evening, she nearly broke her wine glass, pacing her living room as her son complained that the squatters playing games. But she wasn't used to losing, not in this town where everyone bowed to her donations. "If he wants war, he'll get it," she muttered, calling her lawyer and ordering new maps to be drawn. She didn't realize every move she made was already being watched, not by Jacob alone, but by others who respected the Hale family and were tired of her power games. Rumors started to spread that Karen was trying to steal historical property, and people began whispering at the grocery store, in the diner. Even her own board members grew nervous, but she kept pushing, calling for emergency meetings, issuing fake citations, and filing more papers, yet the more she fought, the worse she looked, because every document she sent, Jacob calmly replied with evidence, every threat she made. He answered with a record older than her entire association. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the sky turned blood-red, Jacob sat on his porch staring down the valley where the HOA lights glimmered like watchful eyes. He knew Karen wasn't finished. She'd come again, probably harder, probably desperate. But he also knew something she didn't. That history, once proven, can't be rewritten, and truth, once shown, doesn't die quietly. He stood, stretching his back, then walked inside to place another log on the fire. His old dog lifted its head, sensing his unease, and Jacob whispered, "Let them come." Outside, the wind began to rise, the trees swaying like they too were bracing for the storm to come. Because this fight wasn't about property anymore, it was about legacy, pride, and the simple truth that no HOA rulebook could outlast the will of a man defending his bloodline. The next morning, he woke to the sound of hammering. Karen's workers building a fence near his road, trying to box him in, but Jacob just smiled, poured his coffee, and watched, because sometimes letting the enemy build their wall only makes their fall louder, and he knew that day was coming soon. The mountains around him silent witnesses to a battle older than any HOA regulation. The battle between truth and arrogance, between memory and greed, and as smoke curled from his chimney into the gray morning sky, Jacob Hale prepared himself, not for surrender, but for the slow, steady war he had already begun to win. Days turned into weeks, and what began as legal letters soon turned into something colder, quieter, and crueler. Karen Lawson was no longer just sending papers. She was sending messages meant to break Jacob's peace, the kind that come at night when the world sleeps. It started small, a tire slashed, a fence post broken, strange footprints near his porch, but each act carried her invisible signature. The same smugness that lived behind her perfect smile. Jacob didn't react. He fixed his fence, replaced the tire, and carried on as if nothing had changed. But deep down he knew. She was watching, waiting for him to lose his calm. She couldn't stand men who stayed still. She needed chaos. Because control was her weapon. She used whispers like daggers, spreading lies through town that Jacob was squatting illegally, that he forged old documents, that he was unstable. The rumors spread fast, carried by fearful neighbors who didn't dare question her. Soon even the shopkeepers looked uneasy when Jacob entered, their polite smiles turning uncertain. It didn't bother him much. But he could feel the town shifting away from him, piece by piece. Karen was poisoning his world without ever firing a shot. And that was her power. She fought wars behind curtains and called it community service. One afternoon, a county sheriff drove up the dirt road, his car tires crunching the gravel, the sound echoing against the trees. Jacob watched from his porch. The badge glinting under the sunlight, Sheriff Dalton stepped out, hat tilted low, and gave a cautious nod. "Afternoon, Jacob," he said slowly. "Got some complaints from the HOA saying you're occupying land under review." Jacob didn't move from his chair. He just pointed to the framed copy of his deed resting by the window. "You want to read it yourself." Dalton sighed, rubbing his neck. "You know how this goes. Paperwork keeps coming, and I'm stuck in the middle of it." Jacob's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, and she's the one writing it." Dalton looked uneasy. "Karen's persuasive, and she's got half the town behind her." Jacob finally stood, his voice calm but heavy. "Then maybe it's time someone stood in front of her." The sheriff nodded slowly, glancing toward the cabin. "I'll file my report, but watch yourself. She's got lawyers lined up like soldiers." Jacob smiled faintly. "I've got something older than lawyers, Sheriff, truth." As Dalton drove away, Jacob felt the pressure building, like a storm gathering behind clear skies, invisible but inevitable. That night, Jacob was sitting by the fire when he heard a faint rustle outside. Then a knock, sharp and cold. He stood quietly, grabbed his flashlight, and opened the door to find an envelope taped to it. Inside was a photo. His cabin taken from the woods, at night. Someone had been close, too close. On the back, a note written in neat handwriting, "You're trespassing on borrowed time." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. The arrogance of the threat was pure Karen. She wanted to scare him, to make him doubt his safety, but all it did was harden him further. He burned the photo in the fireplace, watched the paper curl and vanish, and whispered, "Try harder." Still, Even with his calm, the pressure was real. He started hearing footsteps in the woods at night, the snap of branches, headlights flashing briefly before vanishing into darkness. Sometimes his dog barked toward the tree line, growling until dawn. Jacob didn't call the police, because in towns like Cedar Ridge, the HOA's voice carried louder than justice. Instead, he set up more cameras, checking every corner, every window, every path. And every night he slept with the old rifle his grandfather left behind leaning beside the bed. Not because he wanted a fight, but because he knew one was coming. Meanwhile, Karen had grown bolder, showing up at the diner or post office whenever Jacob did, always smiling, always acting polite. But her words carried poison. "I hope you're not getting too comfortable up there, Mr. Hale," she'd say. "We wouldn't want the county to think you're ignoring legal authority." Her tone sounded friendly to outsiders, but Jacob could hear the venom under every syllable. She enjoyed the game, the way everyone watched, whispering, wondering who was right. She even started showing him fake documents, old photocopies with altered maps. "See this?" she'd say, tapping a spot near his cabin. "That line means my family owned the southern tract before the HOA took over. That includes your property." Jacob never argued, he just nodded and walked away, and that silence frustrated her more than insults ever could. Because she wanted to see him lose control, she wanted a reaction she could use against him. But Jacob wasn't playing her game, he was writing his own. Then came the day she crossed the line from paper to power. One morning he found his access road blocked with concrete barriers. A new sign reading "Private Property, HOA Authorized Entry Only." And when he called the county office, the clerk said they received an updated boundary submission from Cedar Ridge Heights, signed by Karen Lawson. Jacob drove straight down to the HOA office, walked through the glass doors, and saw her sitting behind the counter like a queen on her throne, tapping her pen against a stack of files. "Mr. Hale," she said sweetly, "how can I help you?" He dropped the photo of the roadblock on her desk. "By explaining why I can't reach my own home." She smiled without looking up. "Oh, that? Temporary safety measure until ownership is clarified. You wouldn't want anyone trespassing on disputed property." Jacob leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "The only trespassers I've seen wear suits and hide behind rules they don't understand." Her eyes flicked up, sharp, careful. "Mr. Hale, threats won't help your case." He smiled faintly, "Neither will lies," and then walked out, leaving her fuming behind her desk, because nothing made her angrier than being treated like she didn't matter. By the end of that week, Karen's son showed up at the cabin again, this time with 2 HOA guards, armed with clipboards and Arrogance. They claimed they were there to inspect for safety violations. Jacob stood on his porch and told them they weren't setting foot inside. But one of them tried to push past him, muttering about authority. Jacob's dog growled, low and deep, the kind of growl that makes smart men stop moving, and suddenly they did. The son stepped back, trying to laugh it off. "Relax, we're just checking the place out. It'll be ours soon anyway." Jacob said nothing, but the coldness in his eyes made the younger man stumble over his own words. After they left, Jacob checked his cameras again, made copies, and stored them in a safe place. Every trespass, every act of intimidation, documented, sealed, ready to explode at the right moment. Meanwhile, the town itself had begun to divide. Half of Cedar Ridge whispered that Jacob was a stubborn old man standing in the way of progress. The other half quietly admired his courage. Some even stopped by in secret, offering words of support. One old neighbor told him, "She's been trying to take over everything. You're the first one that didn't fold." And Jacob simply nodded. Then maybe it's time she learns not everyone does. That night he wrote a letter to the County Historical Society, enclosing copies of the deed and photos of the cabin, explaining its history and the ongoing harassment. He didn't expect an answer soon, but he knew once they got involved, the HOA's power would start to crumble, because nothing scared modern greed more than the weight of history on paper. Karen, on the other hand, was losing patience. Her son mocked her for not ending it faster, and her board members were getting nervous about the attention the dispute was drawing. But Karen's pride was stronger than reason. She wanted to win not because she needed the land, but because she couldn't stand losing to someone she considered beneath her, and that obsession began to show. She started calling emergency meetings, shouting at her staff, rewriting reports late into the night. Yet no matter what she did, Jacob always stayed one step ahead, quiet, unshaken, a ghost she couldn't intimidate. And that drove her mad. One evening, sitting in her glass-walled living room overlooking the valley, She stared at the light from Jacob's cabin flickering between the trees and whispered, "You don't belong here." But even as she said it, she knew deep down she was the one out of place, because his roots were in that land long before her HOA ever drew its first boundary. The next morning, Jacob woke to the sound of tires again, another SUV, another attempt. But this time he didn't rise from his chair, he just watched from the window. The calm of a man who had already decided that no matter how hard she pushed, she could never take what wasn't hers, and for the first time, the war between them wasn't about property anymore. It was about pride, and in that kind of war, patience was the deadliest weapon of all, because Karen was already cracking, and Jacob hadn't even started fighting back. The night had fallen heavy over Cedar Ridge, the kind of night where the mountains seemed to hold their breath and the forest whispered like it knew a secret. Rain dripped slowly from the eaves of Jacob's cabin, the steady rhythm matching the pounding in his chest. The storm outside had not come from the sky, it had come from Karen's endless attacks, her letters, her barriers, her false accusations, each one trying to erode his patience like water carving stone. But Jacob was not made of stone, he was made of the same wood that built his cabin, old, strong, and impossible to break without fire. And tonight that fire had begun to burn quietly in his eyes. He sat alone at his table, the dim light of a single oil lamp flickering against the old walls. The letter from the county lay open before him, another notice, another attempt to frighten him. He didn't read it anymore, he didn't need to. Because the war had changed, it was no longer about who owned the land, it was about who truly belonged to it. And Karen Lawson could never understand belonging. She only understood owning. That difference was everything. Jacob stood slowly, his knees creaking like the old boards beneath his feet, and walked toward the fireplace where his grandfather's rifle still leaned against the wall. Above it hung the portrait of Thomas Hale, the man who built this cabin with his bare hands and a promise. A man who wrote his name on the deed when Cedar Ridge was nothing but wilderness. Jacob stared at the portrait and whispered, "You kept your word, old man, now it's my turn." Then he knelt down beside the hearth, feeling along the edge of the stone until his fingers brushed the loose plank beneath it. The same one his grandfather had once told him never to touch unless he had to, and tonight, he had to. He pried the board up carefully, the wood dry and splintered with age, and beneath it lay the chest, small, iron, and blackened by time. The hinges rusted but still strong. He pulled it out slowly, the weight heavier than he remembered, as if generations of memory were pressing down on it. He placed it on the table, wiped the dust away, and for a long moment just stared at it, the way a man stares at something sacred. The cabin was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the low rumble of thunder rolling across the ridge. When he finally opened the chest, the hinges groaned like an old voice waking from sleep. Inside were the relics of his family's past. Letters written in faded ink, sepia photographs of men standing proudly in front of the same cabin, military medals, and wrapped in oilcloth. The original deed. He unwrapped it slowly, the smell of old paper and wax filling the air, his hands trembling slightly as he spread it open on the table. The name Thomas Hale etched in elegant script, beneath it the seal of the county clerk dated 1875. The ink still bold enough to read even after all these years. He traced his finger over the lines, the legal language simple and final, granting ownership to Thomas Hale and his bloodline in perpetuity. That one word, perpetuity, was the chain that connected him to this land stronger than any fence Karen could build, stronger than any law she could twist. Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper as thunder flashed through the window, illuminating his face in brief bursts of light. Outside, the rain poured harder, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. But Jacob wasn't afraid of storms. He'd lived through worse. His mind drifted back to when his grandfather showed him that chest for the first time. He was only 10. The old man had lifted the lid and said, "This is more than proof, boy. This is our spine. They can break your body, they can take your home. But as long as you have this, they can never take your name." And now, all those years later, the words carried new weight. Jacob folded the deed carefully, placed it back in the oilcloth, and smiled faintly, not out of joy but out of defiance. The kind of quiet satisfaction a man feels when he knows the truth is on his side. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I show her what history looks like. But tonight he let the storm rage outside while his heart stayed still. The calm before his own reckoning. He stayed up late into the night reading the letters, tracing the handwriting of ancestors he'd never met. One from his great-grandmother spoke of hard winters. Another from his father written during the war saying he'd return to the cabin soon. All of them tied to this single place. This single piece of land that Karen now dared to claim as her development zone. The irony made Jacob laugh quietly, a bitter sound swallowed by the crackle of the fire. She thought this was just real estate. But for him it was the map of his bloodline carved into the dirt. Every tree, every nail, every stone held a story, and she couldn't buy that with all her money. He knew what he had now wasn't just defense. It was destiny. The kind of proof that could bury her lies in front of every court, every board member, every neighbor who doubted him. But he wasn't going to rush. Patience was his weapon. And he wanted her to build her arrogance higher so that when it fell, the noise would echo through the valley. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the first light of morning filtered through the mist. Jacob walked outside carrying the chest under his arm. The earth was wet, the air heavy with the smell of pine and smoke. He looked around the cabin, at the old trees standing like silent guards, and whispered, "We're not done yet." Then he set the chest down beside the porch, unlocked his truck, and placed it gently behind the seat. Inside that chest was everything, his proof, his family's voice, his revenge without anger. He drove slowly down the mountain road toward town, his mind calm but sharp, passing the new villas where workers in clean clothes hammered away at lifeless wooden frames. He couldn't help but think how fragile their world was, all glass and concrete, built on land they didn't understand. People like Karen built things to be seen, but the Hales built things to last. When he parked near the courthouse, he carried the chest inside under one arm, his boots echoing on the tile. The clerk at the desk looked up surprised. "Mr. Hale, you're here early." Jacob nodded. "I need these verified and copied, certified by your office." The clerk took the papers carefully, reading the first few lines, her eyes widening. "Sir, this is an original county deed." Jacob nodded again. "And it's about to end a long problem." By the time he walked out, the copies were sealed, stamped, and ready. History had officially reawakened. Driving back, he saw Karen's car parked by the road near his gate again, her son leaning on the hood laughing at something on his phone. Jacob stopped the truck, stepped out slowly, the chest still in his hands. Karen turned, her sunglasses glinting. "Out early today, Mr. Hale," she said with that same venomous sweetness. Jacob smiled slightly. "Just taking care of something old." She tilted her head, pretending to care. "You really don't have to fight this. You know, we're offering you a generous relocation package." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me to abandon my bloodline. For what, a parking lot?" Her smile froze, the air thick between them. He could almost hear her ego cracking like thin ice. "It's just property," she said firmly, and Jacob laughed softly. "To you maybe, but to me it's proof of everything you'll never have, roots." He walked past her, ignoring her muttered insult, and carried the chest back inside, setting it once again on his table. The morning light caught the metal surface, gleaming faintly, and he whispered, "Let's see her laugh when she sees you." That night, as he sealed the copies in a folder marked for court, the firelight danced across the walls, and for the first time since the fight began, Jacob felt peace, not because the war was over, but because now he held the one thing no one could twist, the truth written by time itself, a truth that waited patiently, like a loaded gun behind glass, ready for the right moment to be revealed. And in that silence, as the mountain winds whispered outside, the Hale cabin stood unshaken, its heart still beating through the man who refused to bow, and the old chest, once buried in shadows, now glowed softly in the firelight. The final witness of a legacy that would not be. By the end of that week, the tension in Cedar Ridge had thickened like storm clouds before lightning. Whispers traveled through diners and grocery aisles about a special HOA meeting called by Karen Lawson herself, something about a final resolution regarding disputed land. Everyone knew whose land it was, and everyone knew Karen loved drama more than justice. Jacob heard about the meeting from a neighbor who stopped by nervously that morning. "They're saying it's over, Jacob," the man said quietly. "She's calling for a vote." Jacob only nodded, his calm eyes fixed on the fire burning low in his hearth. "Then I'll bring my vote too," he said, packing the folder that held the certified copies of the deed and the photos of every trespass Karen's team had made, along with a flash drive containing video evidence. He dressed in his old denim jacket, the same one his father wore when he took him to town fairs, a jacket that smelled faintly of sawdust and pine, a jacket that made him feel rooted, unmovable, and when he drove down the winding road toward the HOA hall, he saw luxury cars parked in neat rows, lights glowing inside the modern glass building that looked too clean, too polished. For a place built on lies, he parked his old truck right at the front like a statement, the sound of its engine breaking the sterile silence of their perfect world. When he stepped out, every head near the door turned, whispers followed, but Jacob's steady footsteps swallowed them. Inside, the meeting room was full, board members sitting stiffly at the long wooden table, Karen at the center like a queen surrounded by her court, her son lounging at the end, smirking, pretending to be bored but watching everything. Lawyers in suits stood near the walls, their briefcases lined up like shields, and behind them, curious residents sat in folding chairs, hungry for a show. Karen smiled as Jacob walked in, her voice dripping with practiced politeness. "Mr. Hale, I wasn't sure you'd attend, considering this meeting is more of a formality." Jacob glanced around the room, his voice steady. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Karen gestured to a chair at the far end of the table. "Please, take a seat." He didn't move right away. Instead he looked at the projector already set up, the stack of papers in front of her, the smug certainty in her eyes, and he understood exactly what this was. An ambush dressed in professionalism. A trap made of paperwork and applause. He finally sat, folding his hands on the table, calm as ever, while Karen began her performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her tone loud and clear, "after months of review and research, the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association has concluded that the structure known as the Hale Cabin lies within the jurisdiction of Cedar Ridge Heights, and by previous property transition, belongs legally to the Lawson family." Applause from her side echoed weakly. She smiled at the noise like a politician. On stage, then turned her gaze toward Jacob. "Mr. Hale, we understand your emotional attachment, but facts are facts, and the law must be followed." Jacob let her finish, every word like a rope she didn't realize she was tightening around her own neck. When she finally leaned back, proud and satisfied, he spoke softly but clearly. "Are you sure you want that statement recorded in the minutes?" The question hung in the air like thunder. Karen frowned slightly. "Of course, it's official," she said. "Everything here is being documented." Jacob nodded slowly. "Good." Then he reached into his bag and placed a small envelope on the table, sliding it toward her. "Because this," he said, "is the only set of facts that matter." Karen hesitated before opening it, pulling out a folded sheet of paper, and when she saw the county seal, her smile faltered for the first time. "That's the original deed to the Hale property," Jacob said calmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs around the room. "Filed in 1875, signed by the county clerk, granting ownership to my great-grandfather and his heirs in perpetuity. Which includes me." A few gasps spread through the crowd, but Jacob wasn't done. He reached again into his bag and laid out a second document. "And this is the certified verification from the county records office, dated this week," then a flash drive. "And this," he said, "contains video of your team trespassing on my property, damaging my porch, and marking boundaries illegally." The lawyer at Karen's side stiffened, whispering something into her ear, but Jacob kept going. "You wanted facts, Mrs. Lawson. Well, there they are, written by time, recorded by law, and witnessed by your own arrogance." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's face twitched, the color draining as she flipped through the documents, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't prove anything. Anyone could fake old papers," she said. But even she didn't sound convinced. Jacob leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Then you can take it up with the county historian sitting right outside this room. He's waiting for this meeting to end." The lawyer froze. "The historian?" Jacob nodded. "Yes, I invited him personally. Figured since we're rewriting history today, someone who knows it should be here." Karen tried to speak, but her lawyer cut in quietly. "Karen, this could be serious. The seal's real. The file number matches our registry." She glared at him. "Don't you dare." But he didn't meet her eyes, sweat beading at his temple. One of the board members leaned toward her and whispered something urgent. And suddenly the confident rhythm of the meeting shattered, voices overlapped, people argued softly, unsure who to believe. But the power in the room had already shifted. Jacob didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to, because the truth sat on the table like a weapon no one could disarm. Karen stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "This meeting is adjourned until further verification," trying to regain control. But even as she said it, the county historian entered through the door, carrying an old leather-bound record book. "No need to adjourn," he said calmly. "I've verified the deed myself. It's authentic and binding. The Hale property was exempt from later zoning laws due to its historical registration." Every head turned toward him, and Jacob just leaned back, silent. The faintest trace of a smile touching his lips, the historian continued, "Any action taken by the HOA against Mr. Hale's land constitutes harassment and unlawful claim." Karen's son muttered a curse under his breath, and the board fell silent. The trap she set had snapped, but around her own ankle, not his. Jacob stood slowly, gathering his papers. "Meeting's over," he said quietly. "You've done enough damage for one generation." Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked, words tumbling uselessly into the heavy air. The lawyer reached for his briefcase, already knowing what came next. Lawsuits, fines, maybe worse, because in that one moment, the Queen of Cedar Ridge had been stripped of her crown by a man who never raised his tone. As Jacob walked out into the sunlight, the crowd followed him with their eyes, some out of respect, some out of shock, but none dared speak. Outside, the wind had changed, softer, freer, carrying the scent of pine and rain. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot and looked back once at the glass building, seeing Karen through the window, standing motionless, her hand clutching the fake documents she had forged, her empire of lies collapsing around her. Jacob climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away slowly, the old engine's rumble echoing like thunder leaving the valley, and for the first time since the battle began, he felt the mountain breathe again, the road stretching ahead of him like an old friend, and he smiled faintly, not out of triumph, but out of quiet relief, because the fight was nearly over, and the truth, once buried in a hidden chest beneath his floor, had finally stood in the open, shining brighter than any spotlight Karen had ever used to blind others. The next morning came heavy with silence, the kind that hangs before the world changes. Clouds sat low over Cedar Ridge, mist curling between the trees like the valley itself was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the smell of paper, coffee, and tension filled the air. Jacob stood near the back wall, his hat in his hands, the folder tucked neatly under his arm, while Karen Lawson sat at the front table with her lawyer, pale and stiff, her perfect poise cracked just enough for everyone to see the nerves underneath. The county clerk read through the documents slowly, every word echoing in the stillness. The audience of townsfolk sat watching, some whispering, most silent, waiting for the verdict that everyone already knew in their hearts. According to the verified record, the clerk said, her voice steady, the Hale cabin and surrounding acreage belonged to the descendants of Thomas Hale, recorded and sealed in 1875 under federal land preservation. This deed supersedes any claim by the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. The sound of the gavel striking the desk was soft but final, and in that moment, the war that had dragged through months of threats, lies, and arrogance ended not with shouting but with silence, the kind of silence that carries victory inside it. Karen's face went white, her lips trembling as she tried to protest. "This can't be. There must be a mistake." Her lawyer leaned closer, whispering frantically, "There's no mistake, Karen. This is binding. It's over." She shook her head, standing too quickly, her chair scraping across the floor. "No, he forged it. He had to," she shouted, her voice breaking, but the county historian rose from his seat, calm as a man used to patience. "The ink, the seal, the file number, the archive, everything matches perfectly, Mrs. Lawson. The document is authentic." Every word he spoke hit her like a hammer. The crowd murmured softly, shifting, some shaking their heads, others watching with quiet satisfaction, and Jacob, still standing near the back, didn't say a word, his calm face unshaken. He didn't need to gloat or explain, because the truth was doing it for him. He simply looked down at the deed framed under glass in his hands and whispered under his breath, "It's done, Grandpa, we did it." While outside, the first rays of sunlight began breaking through the gray clouds, painting golden streaks across the courthouse steps. The sheriff, who had once come to his porch under HOA orders, now stood beside him and gave a small nod. "Guess the law finally remembered its job," he said quietly. Jacob smiled faintly. "Sometimes it just needs a little reminding." And together they stepped outside, the door creaking open to a different kind of Cedar Ridge, one where truth finally stood taller than greed. Across the street, a few of the HOA board members slipped away quickly, avoiding eye contact, while others lingered, their faces red with embarrassment. One older woman even walked up to Jacob, her eyes wet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. We should have stopped her sooner. Jacob just nodded gently. It's done now. Just remember, some land doesn't need new owners. It just needs respect. His voice was calm, kind even, and that calm made his victory hit harder than any revenge ever could. Back inside, Karen sat frozen, staring at the empty chair where her lawyer had been. The room nearly empty now except for her son, who stood awkwardly near the door, not saying a word. The young man who had once bragged about inheriting Jacob's cabin now couldn't even meet his eyes. "Come on, Mom," he said finally, his voice low, "let's just go." But Karen didn't move, her hands clenched around a useless folder of fake documents. The same ones she had once waved like a sword. Now nothing more than paper lies, she muttered. It was supposed to be ours, it was supposed to. But her voice cracked into silence. Her son walked out, leaving her alone in the echo of her own downfall. Outside the courthouse, the local newspaper photographer snapped pictures of Jacob holding the deed, and the headline the next day would read, "Historic Hale Cabin Restored to Family, HOA President Found Guilty of False Claims." The news spread faster than she could control it, and within a week, the HOA's name became a symbol of greed gone too far. When Jacob returned to the mountain road that evening, the mist had cleared and the cabin stood proud against the sinking sun. The air was quiet except for the rustle of the trees, and the golden light touched the old wood like it was alive again. He parked the truck, walked up the porch, and hung the framed deed right beside the front door, just above the old photograph of his grandfather. It fit there perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. He stood back, hands on his hips, breathing in the scent of pine and smoke, then smiled softly. "You're safe now," he said to the house, his words blending with the wind that swept through the valley, carrying the faint echo of generations past. He sat down on the porch with a cup of coffee, the steam curling in the evening light, the world around him at peace again, the dogs asleep by the step, the mountains glowing in the distance, and for the first time in months, his chest felt light, no anger, no fear, just quiet. Satisfaction that comes when the truth finally wins. Down below, in the fancy glass home Karen had built, the silence was heavier. Reporters had been calling all day, neighbors whispering, board members resigning one by one. Her reputation crumbled faster than she could rebuild it. She stood in her spotless kitchen staring at her reflection in the dark window, remembering how confident she once felt when she drove up Jacob's dirt road and declared his cabin her son's inheritance. Now she could barely look at herself, the arrogance that once made her powerful had become her curse, and in the end, all she had left were excuses no one wanted to hear. The world had moved on, and she was the only one still clinging to the illusion of control. She poured herself a drink but couldn't even bring herself to sip it, because every time she blinked, she saw his calm face, the man who never raised his voice, never threatened, never begged. He just waited, like the mountain itself, until her lies fell apart. Back on the ridge, Jacob watched the last light fade over the hills, the cabin glowing with the fire inside, its windows reflecting the stars beginning to rise. He thought about how close he came to losing everything, not because of force, but because of deceit, and he promised himself it would never happen again. He'd seen enough of how power hides behind smiles and titles. He'd seen how people like Karen believe papers and rules make them untouchable. But they always forget one thing. The land remembers, the truth remembers, and in the end, it always finds its way home. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly beneath him, his dog lifting its head just long enough to rest it on his boot. The night air cool and still, the world right again. He closed his eyes, the flicker of the fire dancing behind his eyelids, and as the mountain wind whispered through the trees, the Hale name, written in old ink and sealed in time, finally rested where it belonged, in the hands of the man who refused to surrender it. Weeks passed after the courthouse verdict and Cedar Ridge began to breathe again. The whispers faded, the tension dissolved, and life returned to the slow rhythm of the mountains. But for Karen Lawson, peace was something that refused to visit her doorstep. Her name had become poison in town. Every newspaper headline repeated the story she wanted to bury. HOA president exposed for fraud. Residents who once followed her now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Even her board, the people she ruled with arrogance and fear, resigned one after another until she was left sitting alone in the office that once smelled of victory, now reeking of dust and regret. Her son had moved away quietly, unable to face the shame, and the mansion she built on other people's land now felt too big, too silent. She spent her days looking out at the ridge where Jacob's cabin stood, small but strong, a symbol of something she could never own, honor. Meanwhile, Jacob's days grew slower, softer, filled with quiet routines that made the cabin feel alive again. Every morning he swept the porch, polished the wood around the windows, and hung small lanterns his grandfather had carved by hand. Visitors began arriving, local students, historians, even families who wanted to see the old Hale cabin, now officially listed as a historic landmark. The county had placed a small bronze plaque at the gate, reading, "Preserved by the Hale family, established 1875. Jacob didn't ask for the recognition, but when he saw it glinting under the sunlight, he felt a warmth deeper than pride. It was legacy, pure and earned. The townspeople began to treat him differently, not with pity, but with respect. The same sheriff who once brought warnings now stopped by for coffee. The same neighbors who stayed quiet during his fight now brought their kids to hear stories about the old days. One evening, the mayor herself came up the dirt road, carrying a certificate declaring the cabin a heritage of Cedar Ridge. She handed it to him with a humble smile. "You didn't just save your land, Mr. Hale. You reminded this town who it was before the money came." Jacob nodded slowly, taking the paper and placing it gently on the wall beside the deed. "I didn't do it for the town," he said softly. "I did it for the people who built it." And though the words were simple, they carried more truth than any speech she'd heard in years. When she left, the air around the cabin felt lighter, freer, like the mountain itself approved. But not far away, in that once luxurious HOA office now half empty, Karen sat under flickering lights going through old files, her eyes hollow, the arrogance drained from her like color from old paint. She tried to write letters to explain herself, but no one cared anymore, no one answered. Her empire had fallen to silence, the kind that follows when truth walks in and lies run out of places to hide. She stared at her reflection in the glass door, older somehow, smaller, and whispered to herself, it was just a cabin. But deep down she knew it wasn't. It was a mirror, one that showed her what kind of person she'd become. She had chased land but lost her name, and now all that remained was the echo of her downfall carried through the same wind that brushed over Jacob's porch. Up on the ridge, Jacob sat in his rocking chair as dusk settled across the mountains, the world bathed in gold and blue, the trees swaying softly as if whispering approval. His dog lay asleep beside his boots, the smell of pine and firewood filling the air, and he looked at the framed deed on the wall glowing under the lamplight. The old signature still bold, still proud, and he smiled quietly, thinking of his grandfather, of his father, of the people who built everything with their hands. Instead of their words, he thought of how greed had tried to erase them, and how patience and truth had brought them back. He lifted his coffee mug, raising it slightly toward the mountains, and said under his breath, "Here's to the ones who came before." The wind answered in a low whisper through the trees, almost like the past itself was toasting him back. He chuckled softly, leaned back, and watched the stars blink awake over the valley, their faint light catching the roof of his old cabin, turning it silver. As night deepened, the road below glimmered faintly with the headlights of cars passing through, people coming to see what the papers called the cabin that beat the HOA. And though Jacob wasn't a man who liked crowds, he never turned anyone away. He would step onto the porch, tell them the story in his slow, steady voice, how one woman thought power could erase history, and how history reminded her otherwise. People listened, nodding, some smiling, others thinking of their own fights, because every person in that mountain town had lost something once, to greed, to pride, to people like Karen. But Jacob's story gave them something back, hope that right can still win if you hold on long enough. When the visitors left, he'd sit back down by the fire, the crackle filling the room, his dog curling close, and he'd watch the flames flicker against the old photos on the wall, every face smiling back through time. And he felt the weight of generations not as a burden, but as comfort, the kind that comes when you've finally done what you were meant to do. And so the cabin stood, stronger than ever, its wooden walls still whispering stories of the people who lived, loved, and fought within them. The wind carried their memory down the slopes, across the trees, through the valleys where greed had tried to plant roots but failed, and every morning when sunlight touched the porch, it felt like a blessing, not just for Jacob, but for the land itself, as if the mountain remembered him, trusted him, and stood guard beside him. While down below, the villas that once mocked his old cabin began to fall quiet. New buyers came and went, the HOA's influence fading into history like a bad rumor. and people began saying Cedar Ridge was better now, calmer, fairer, more human, all because one man refused to bow. On one cool evening near the end of fall, Jacob placed a small wooden sign on his gate, hand-carved with simple words, "The Hale Cabin, built by hands, defended by heart." And as he stepped back to look at it, he smiled, not because he'd won, but because he'd proven that some things were never meant to be taken, only protected. And as the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the world in amber light, Jacob Hale sat on his porch, the mountain breeze brushing against his face, the smell of smoke and pine drifting through the air, and in that moment, everything was quiet, everything was whole. The war was over, the truth had prevailed, and the legacy of the Hale family, sealed once in ink and hidden in a chest beneath the floorboards, now lived forever in the open air, beneath the endless sky of Cedar Ridge, where some battles end not with revenge, but with peace.